Hi, everyone, and welcome to Get Hired Live. Welcome to Career Talks. I'm your host, Andrew Seaman, and I am the senior news editor for job searches and careers. So today we're talking all about salary negotiations. And before we get to that, I want you to introduce yourselves in the comments. So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from. We already have so many people doing that. We have Jeff from Minneapolis, Gina from San Francisco, Eric from Brazil, Derek from Colorado, and Dipti from Boston. So introduce yourselves in the comments. Tell us a little bit about what you're looking for in your job search and career. And we'll obviously be taking your questions, especially about salary negotiations. And we have a great guest for you today, Austin Belsack, who is the founder of Cultivated Culture. So let's bring him onto the screen. Welcome, Austin.
Hey, Andrew, how's it going? Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us. So, I guess the first thing I want to say is that, salary is obviously one of those questions during the job search that gives people a lot of anxiety. And we have a lot of people in the stream today who I'm sure has grappled with this before. And, when it comes to salary, why is it so important for candidates and sort of anxiety producing?
For sure. So the biggest thing about salary negotiation is obvious, right? It's the fact that we stand to make more money. And that's something that all of us want to do, right? That's why we work in the first place. And for many of us, the goal is to maximize our earnings for all of the benefits that come with that. But the thing is, as we peel back the layers and as we dive deeper into that specific topic, there are some interesting things that come to light. So first and foremost, most people don't negotiate their salary. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. But on top of that, people, I don't think really understand just how much money they're leaving on the table by not negotiating their salary. So I have some numbers here, and I always like to give this example whenever I start talking to somebody, whether it's a client or a job seeker, whoever it is, about why they should be negotiating salary in the first place. So the headline here is that if you're not negotiating your salary, you're potentially missing out on around $400,000 to $500,000 over the course of your career, which is an insane, mind-boggling amount of money, right? So to illustrate this, I want to share an example with two people here. So we have Amari and we have Taylor. So both Amari and Taylor today make the same amount of money. They make $100,000. And let's say that they're going to be working for 20 more years. And every 5 years, they're going to change jobs. So they're going to get a new job at a different company, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to come with some sort of raise. Now, Amari never negotiates salary. So they go in, they get their offer, they accept it as is, and they average an 8% raise every 5 years for that new job. On the other hand, Taylor always negotiates. Taylor takes all the tactics and tips that we're going to talk about on today's live. They apply them whenever they get an offer, and they end up averaging a 20% raise for every new job that they get. Again, seeing a new job every 5 years. So at the end of 20 years, what's the difference here? Well, Taylor, who has negotiated every single time they've gotten an offer, has made $430,000 more than Amari over the course of those 20 years. And they're currently making $46,000 more every single year moving forward. So the reason I like to share that example is because those percentages that I shared are real. So if you don't negotiate your salary, the average raise is actually a little bit smaller than 8%. I used 8% to give people some benefit of the doubt, but it's really more in the 3 to 5% range. Whereas if you do negotiate your salary, when you get a new job, the average is closer to 20%. So these are real numbers, and 20 years is the trajectory of a career for most people. Sometimes we can extend it to 30, in which case there's even more money left on the table. But the truth is, if you are not negotiating, you are leaving a ton of money on the table, even if it's less than the figure that we just shared. But as we talked about, there is some hesitancy around why people want to negotiate their salary. And this is really, really interesting because when we look at the data, and we can jump into that second part of your question here where you ask why people are hesitant, we actually have a slide with some numbers that are based on a salary.com survey, which asks people why they don't negotiate their salary. And what they found first and foremost was that 61% of people don't negotiate their salary at all. And of the people who do negotiate their salary, the other 39% here, here's the breakout. And what I'd love to see in the comments here for everybody who's tuned in, which one of these four answers best describes why you don't negotiate salary if you're not negotiating it? So the biggest reason people don't negotiate is because they're scared of being rejected. So they're scared of showing up and saying, hey, I want more money, and having the company say, well, that's too bad. You seem greedy. We're going to take this offer back and give it to somebody who's less greedy than you are. That is the biggest reason that people don't negotiate. Second, well, really tied for second, we have people who don't think that they have the actual skills needed to successfully negotiate their salary. And then we have people who fear they'd be removed from the process if they ask for more money. And I think we could even lump this into the first response here. But these are people who are, again, worried that they may come off as greedy, or there may be some preconceived notion about them if they do get hired, where that's going to impact their future trajectory at the company because they asked for more money up front. And then finally, 13% were wary of other kinds of lingering retribution if the request went south. So as you can see, a lot of these actually kind of meld into one thing, which is we're scared of being rejected. And we're also scared that even if we're not rejected, we end up in this place where people are maybe holding grudges against us, or it's impacting our upward mobility or our brand at the company. And all of these things simply aren't true. So today, my whole goal is to give everybody listening ways to feel more confident, to not worry about any of the things that they see on the screen here, and to be able to go into that next salary negotiation process with a framework, and with actionable steps that they can take to maximize their earning potential.
Definitely. Yeah. And, we have so many people joining us in the stream. I just want to give a quick shout out. Diana from Canada, Bill from New York City, Maria from Toronto, Nathan from West Virginia, and Patty from Montreal. They all introduced themselves in the stream. And I have to say, everyone in the stream was overwhelmingly mentioning fear when it came to the reasons that they don't want to negotiate. And I've heard that from a lot of people, where they say, hey, the company doesn't negotiate. In fact, I saw that in the stream a few times where it said, I was told up front, they don't negotiate. So, there's definitely concern if you push back that they'll just say, hey, this is the offer, take it or leave it. And I think, another thing that sort of trips people up is the timing of salary negotiation. Because obviously you're showing that there is dramatic upside to salary negotiation. And in fact, I think I saw from Alka in the comments, she said that the money left on the table was mind-boggling from the stats you shared. So, the conversation can start anywhere between the application process or even the offer. When is the best time, do you think, to start that conversation for salary negotiation?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And even before we touch on that, just speaking to what some of those people said, first and foremost, if a company comes to you and says, we don't negotiate salary, to me, that's an immediate red flag. If they do that up front with you, at least they're being honest up front, and they don't make you go through the whole process before you discover that. But to me, that's a red flag, because at the end of the day, the best companies out there want the best talent. That's their sole goal, because they realize that if they hire the best talent, they are going to get the best ROI, even if they have to pay a little bit more to get those folks, even if they have to offer some more benefits, some more packages that it's going to cost them a bit more on the expense front, but they know the ROI is going to be drastically worth it, simply because they're bringing in the best people. So what I would say is, if a company shows up and before they've even talked to you or anybody else, and they say, this is the salary, that to me is a red flag. And I would be wary about what that would mean for me if I did get hired at that company. Because what happens when I want a promotion and maybe I'm the best person on my team, but there's some set in stone rule that says you have to do X, Y, and Z things. Maybe you have to work at the company 3 years before you're promoted or something like that, where you're not eligible for these things simply because it's the way we've always done it, or because these are the rules. Whenever companies aren't flexible on things that allow them to keep their employees' best interests in mind, but also enable their employees to do their best work and bring them the most value, that's a big red flag that I'm going to be wary of. So I think it's really important to mention that, because at the end of the day, the job search is a two-way street. As candidates, and the whole point of this stream is that we should feel empowered, right? As candidates, we should show up to the table and say, I have a lot of value to offer here. I know what that value is worth. I deserve to be compensated at that level of value. And that's the level that I'm going to bring to the table if you hire me. It's not just, oh, I'm so grateful that you were the company that decided to offer me a job and I have to accept this and bend to your every whim. So we need to change the mindset a little bit there. And we need to be wary of those types of red flags, because the last thing you want to do is go through this whole process and then end up in a job that you don't love, that doesn't treat you well, that doesn't pay you what you're worth, and then you have to go back and start the whole thing again. So I think that's worth mentioning up front. Now, to go back to your question, Andrew, when should you negotiate salary? At what point during the process? So this is something that I've seen a lot of different opinions on. I've seen people say that you should negotiate it at the very beginning. I've seen people say that you should negotiate it at the very end. And my personal preference here is to negotiate it at the very beginning. Now, before I explain why, I do want to address the folks who say you should negotiate it at the end. So what those people typically say is that you want to wait until the end of the process to negotiate your salary, because as you get closer to the end, you become more valuable, right? You've already gone through the rounds. You've become familiar and your value has become quantifiable to the team members, to the hiring team. And so because they feel that you are, this great candidate that's made it so deep into the rounds of their interview process, these people who are saying you should wait to have this conversation, they believe that your value increases and you have more leverage during negotiations. But what usually ends up happening here is that candidates go through this whole process and then they find out that the company's range was not aligned with their own range. And they typically get what they perceive to be a low ball offer. So a lot of clients, a lot of job seekers come to me and they say, "Hey, Austin, I just got this massive low ball offer from a company. Like, what do I do?" And the first question I ask them is, when did you start talking about salary? And more often than not, they say that they didn't start talking about it until the final rounds, until after the offer was given. And so this really wasn't a low ball offer, more likely than not. Instead, what it is the company offering what was in their range. The ranges just simply hadn't been spoken about. They hadn't been aligned yet. So I think that you stand to lose a lot more than you stand to gain by negotiating at the very end. The other thing that you stand to lose is information. So going into the reasons why I think you should have this conversation as early as possible. If you know how to handle this conversation well, if you've done your research, if you understand the ranges, the data, the value that you're worth, and you come to the table with that, and then you also have a specific plan for the conversation, and we're going to give you all of this as we go through the session here. If you show up to the first conversation or the early conversations and you have that talk about salary, a couple of things are happening. One, you're aligning your expectations from the very beginning. So if this company was not prepared to pay you what you're worth and they will not budge on it, then you don't have to waste all of these hours going through the interview process. Because when we interview, right, we have to take time away from our current job to have a phone screen. Or in some cases, we actually have to take days off to go to this super day. Sometimes we're even flying out to these offices overnight if the company is hosting us, right? We don't want to go through all of that. We don't want to invest all of these hours in a company that's not going to be able to pay us what we're worth. So we need to set that expectation up front. And I know that can be scary. And I know it can feel like, well, if I give a number, am I going to lose out? Am I leaving stuff on the table? Don't worry. We're going to give you a solution and a framework to handle that. But the beautiful thing is if we actually take that fear-based mindset and we flip it to an opportunistic mindset, by having this conversation early, we can understand the company's range. So we know what we're working with at the very beginning. And then we can use all of the time through the rest of the interview process to plan and prepare and strategize for how we're going to maximize our earning potential when it does come time to actually have that offer in front of us and have those deeper conversations about negotiating. So for me, I always recommend having the conversation as early as possible, but you have to be confident in the conversation that you're going to have. You have to feel confident in the strategies and the data. So that's what we're going to talk about on the rest of the session here.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember that, there's been twice where people have come to me about jobs that I was interested in and I wasn't necessarily looking for work at the time. And, they make you fill out an application at the start just to get their processes rolling. So on the little form, I would put my, the salary that I expected to make at the time. And in both cases, I went through several rounds of interviews. And then when the offer time came, the offer was just incredibly low versus what I put on my sheet. And I had, in both cases, having to have this conversation with these employers saying, listen, why did you put me through all those interviews if, I said on my application that, I expected this? And they said, well, we didn't really read that. And, but, we can only stay in this range. And in the one case, they said, oh, we want to hire someone else. So we can't give much more because we have to give it. And in both cases, I was like, well, you've wasted my time and yours. So, it can definitely be an awkward situation. And you mentioned preparedness and going into a conversation and being armed with sort of, what you are worth, what you deserve, and having the confidence that comes with all of that. So how do you suggest people prepare for those conversations? Because, we don't necessarily have an open look at a company's books to know what they're going to offer us upfront or what they can afford. So what's your suggestion with preparedness?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably one of the biggest areas to focus on as a job seeker. So if you are basically failing to prepare is preparing to fail. That's really what it comes down to. That's not my quote. I forget who I should be attributing it to. But at the end of the day, 80% of salary negotiation happens before you even move into the room, before you even start having the conversation with these people. So, what are we looking for when it comes to research? Well, really, at the end of the day, our goal is to understand what the ranges are for the roles that we're targeting. And we're looking at this at a couple of different levels. So, first, I just want to understand what are the averages for this role when we look nationwide? And then also, how do these averages change when we get more specific? So, if this role that I'm vying for is in New York or Seattle or Des Moines or anywhere else, how do these salary ranges change for the location that I'm going to be working in if I get hired for this role? The other thing I want to look for is what does the competition pay? Because averages are good, but understanding both what the company is going to pay and then also what the competition pays gives us a couple of extra layers of data that we can then use to be more informed about the conversations that we have with the hiring manager or the interviewer or the recruiter, whoever's asking us about salary. So the key thing here when we go into this research phase is we want to understand two specific things. One, we want to understand the ranges for the specific role and the average for the specific role for this company, as well as their competitors. The second thing that we need to walk out of this research phase with is a specific number. So what we want to do is look at those ranges, look at the average salary data, and then also look at what we feel like we're worth, what we want to be paid. Something that I always did before I stepped into an interview with a company or when I was going through the job search process myself was I looked at all of my expenses. I looked at my finances, and then I also looked at my financial plan. And I said, okay, how much do I want to be saving? How much do I want to submit to my 401k? How much do I want to just, pack away in cash or put into a brokerage account? What are my expenses? How much does my rent cost? How much does my car cost? What's my commute look like? And then what I would do is back into a number that made sense there. And what this allowed me to do was get very clear on the specific number that I would need to feel comfortable. So that's really what we're looking for here. And the goal is to have that number be roughly in the 70 to 80% range of the salary that you're targeting. So to make the math easy on myself here, let's say that the range for the role is $0, obviously unrealistic, but $0 to $100,000. Well, the 70 to 80% range for that role would be $70 to $80,000, right? So what typically happens with these ranges is that if you go all the way on the upper end, we always tend to gravitate to the number that makes the most sense for us or that will make us happiest. And we're actually going to use that piece of psychology to speak to the recruiter. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second here. But for us, we're going to gravitate to the higher end of the range because we see those numbers and we're like, yeah, it'd be pretty sweet to be paid that amount of money. But we don't want to be the extreme outlier, right? We don't want to be the person asking for the 95 to 100% of that range. So if we go for 70 to 80%, that is going to put us in a good place. But we also need to make sure that that 70 to 80% aligns with the ranges that we see for the role. So really what you're looking for here, there's two sliders. There's the range that will make you feel comfortable and happy and will allow you to live the life that you want to live. And then there's the range that the company has. And what we want to do is make sure that those overlap as best we can. Now, the key here is that for the number that you pick, for the range that you pick, you want your target salary or target number to be on the bottom end of that range. Because as I just mentioned, we look for the number, we anchor the number that looks best for us, right? So from an employer's point of view, they want to get the best candidate possible for the least amount of money because payroll is by far the biggest line item on any company's balance sheet. So if we can get an awesome talent for $10,000 less, that's a big win. That's $10,000 every single year that the company's saving. So they're going to look at the lower end of that range. So if you have the lower end of your range be right around the target that you're looking for, it's a win-win because the employer looks at that and says, well, they gave me 70 to 80. I want to hire them for 70. And you were hoping for really 65 to 75. Well, now all of a sudden you're right in the middle of your range and you have some wiggle room there. So what I'm getting at here is you want to be prepared to actually have a number. You need to have a specific number, a specific range in mind when you show up to these conversations. We don't want to give it away up front, and I'll show you exactly how to handle that conversation. But we do want to have this number in our heads so that we're able to bring it up on the spot if we are pushed for a number at a certain point. So how do we figure out these ranges? That's the next question. Well, there's a bunch of different tools out there that have awesome info. So I'll share a bunch of tools, but then I'll also give you a couple of tactics that I found to be really helpful as well. So first and foremost, we're on LinkedIn Live. LinkedIn has a great salary tool that will give you insights on all of the roles that you're looking for. It's coming straight from the employers who are posting jobs on LinkedIn. So that is one of the very first places that I would look. Second is Glassdoor. I think a lot of people know of this resource as well, but they tend to give you similar types of ranges, and having more data sets, more ranges from more sources is just going to give you a more accurate picture of what the numbers really look like for these companies. And then there's a couple of other options out there like salary.com, PayScale, et cetera, et cetera. So I would go through all of those resources. And what I would do is, again, try to get the largest sample size of salary range data that you can, not just for your target company, but for their competitors as well, so that you get a sense of what the competition is paying their candidates for the same roles. And you can use that when you have your conversations. So those are a couple of the places that I would go look for specific numbers. But there's two other tactics that I like to use when I'm negotiating or when I'm doing my research for salary negotiation. So the first one is a site called h1bdata.info. So I actually learned about this from my friend Sarah Johnson. She's another fantastic career coach. You should totally go follow her if you don't already. She put me onto this site, and essentially what h1bdata.info does is it collects the data from companies who are sponsoring H1B visas. So when a company sponsors an H1B visa for an international employee coming into the US, what they have to do is share some information about this hire. And one of the things they need to share is the salary. So h1bdata.info actually allows you to see real salaries from people who have been hired for the specific roles that you're targeting. Now, you're not always going to be able to find a ton of salaries or any salaries for the specific role, depending on the types of roles that you're targeting. But that can be a great resource if you are able to find some information there. Another tactic that I really like to use is leveraging LinkedIn and going and finding the job, but then filtering for Colorado as your location. So earlier this year, and I recently posted about this, but earlier this year, I believe it was in January, Colorado passed a law basically mandating employers mandating that employers include a salary on any job description that they post. So employers, they don't want to share salary numbers with you because, as we'll learn, essentially the rule of negotiation 101 is the first person to give a number loses. Now, that's really extreme, and I wouldn't go that far because that puts a lot of stress on us as job seekers, especially given the position that we're in, where we likely will have to share a number at some point. You're not losing if you share a number first, but the way that we share that number is really important. And also, when we do put a number out there, if we do put a number out there first, we do put ourselves at a slight disadvantage. That's just how negotiation works. Don't be scared of that. We're going to use it to our advantage here, because everywhere else that doesn't have this law, employers rather, are not putting these salaries in the job description because they don't have to. If they put them in there, all of a sudden everybody starts to see who's getting paid what. And if I'm an account manager and I'm making 60K, and then I see an account manager role posted on my team for 90K, I'm going to my boss and saying, whoa, why is this new person getting paid $30,000 more than I am? And that's not what the company wants, because what happens when we are transparent about salary is that all of the employees' salaries increase, which increases that expense line on the company's balance sheet. And companies like to do everything they can to keep expenses low and profit margins high. That's why they don't share this information. So Colorado realized this. They realized that it's not fair for candidates, and they basically passed this law. So if you're targeting a role, it doesn't matter what city it's in, go ahead and search for it and then filter for Colorado. And what you'll see is a number in the job search posting. You can literally go do this as soon as this live is over. You can use LinkedIn Jobs to go search for these jobs. You can use LinkedIn to filter for Colorado. You're going to see a salary number there. And then all you have to do is put it in a cost of living calculator, which you can easily find with a quick search online. And it will adjust the salary up to the cost of living standard for the city that you're targeting. So let's say that I'm searching for a user experience design role in New York City. Well, I can go find a user experience design role or multiple roles in Colorado at similar companies or at my target companies. And then I can use a cost of living calculator to say, okay, how much is this salary worth in New York City? And all of a sudden I have a much more accurate range, because that's exactly how companies go about paying their employees. So those are two extra tips on top of the research that I like to use that will help you uncover a little bit more and give you a little bit more information, which I always feel better when I have more information. It makes me more confident in these conversations. So I hope those two are helpful on top of some of the resources we mentioned.
Definitely, yeah. And actually, it's really interesting. The Colorado law ended up moving, companies that are now posting for remote roles. They ended up not actually posting in Colorado, even if they're based there, because if they say that the remote role is based in say, Minnesota or something like that, they don't have to put the salary. So it was interesting to see that companies are shifting even to hide some of the salary data. And then for some of you watching, if you don't know what H-1B visa is, it's basically a visa the United States offers that employers can sponsor to bring workers who have at least a bachelor's degree to the United States temporarily to do a job. So that's where the H-1B comes from. And also, I guess just sort of going back to what you were talking about when you talk about sort of finding that range, Brian in the comments was asking, so you don't need a precise number, but you should have a range then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I would say is that there's two things here. So first and foremost, when we are more general upfront. So the advice I'm going to give is that we want to be more general upfront and more specific as we get later on in the negotiation process. So there's two reasons for that. The first is when we're more general upfront, we appear to be more flexible to the people that we're negotiating with. So if I say, well, I'm being considered for roles in the range of, using the example that I shared before, 70 to 80K, you're giving them a bit of a range, and you're showing that you're flexible. So you're not completely locking yourself out by giving one specific number. And the other reason that's important is because it gives you wiggle room to negotiate, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people know with negotiation, you try to anchor high, right? And then you work your way down. And so that's exactly what we're trying to do here. If we give a range, we can start at the top of the range and we can work our way down, and we still have 10%, $10,000 to go there before we get to the bottom end of our range. And then we realize, okay, this job isn't for me because you're not going to pay me what I'm worth. So we want to start general upfront. And then as we get deeper into the interview, deeper into the process, as we maybe start to get that offer or we're having the final rounds of negotiations, that's when we want to get more specific. And this is a bit of an iterative process. But if I start with, let's say $70,000 to $80,000 as my range, and the recruiter says, that's within the range that we have budgeted for the role. Thanks for sharing that. We progress with the conversations and we get to the end here. Well, now what's going to happen is they're going to offer me a dollar amount. And what they're likely going to do is offer me on the lower end of the range. So, hey, Austin, we'd love to have you come work at LinkedIn. We'll pay you $70,000 a year. I think that's in line with what we spoke about before. So now what you can do is, hopefully you've been planning and strategizing over the period of time between that first salary conversation and this one. But what we can do is then come back to them and we can share a more specific number. And research out of Columbia, I believe the researcher's name was Daniel Ames. He found that candidates who shared specific numbers, so instead of saying I need 70 grand or $75,000, if they said something like, $70,250 is the salary that I'm looking for, they found that candidates who shared that more specific number actually ended up with higher salaries. And the rationale is that when we share a specific number, it appears, or the implication is there, that we've done some calculations and we didn't just land on that number, at random. And so you can easily back into this by doing exactly what I said before. If you go run your budget, if you go run your numbers, if you go say, hey, if I get hired in my next role, what do I want my financial life to look like? And then we can back into that number. Well, now you can come back to the table and you can say something like, thanks for the generous offer. For X, Y, and Z reasons, I feel like I'm a really strong candidate for this role. I've run the numbers, and this is the number that would allow me to come to work and give 100% every single day. And there's your specific number. So if they offered you 70,000, now you can come back and say, well, 74,750 is the number that will allow me to come in and do my best work every single day. Now we're leveraging a bit of that psychology. We're also leveraging the number that is within our range, and we're able to back it up with reasonable, valid points, which makes for the strongest negotiation. So that's why we always want to start general by giving a range. And then you have that whole period of time between that first conversation and the last conversation to dial into that specific number. And that specific number is going to benefit us in later rounds in deeper conversations.
Yeah, no, that's really great tips. And in fact, it was interesting because there's a lot of states in the United States now that are actually forbidding employers from asking people their previous salary. So they're not anchored early on in that conversation to what they were making before. So, you are looking for a job, you do your research, you go into your interview, and they bring up the question, okay, what are you expecting to make in this role? What is your advice for people?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we need to understand here, and I just want to go back to that piece I mentioned around whoever gives the first number loses. That's like a negotiation maxim. So the reason that this is really important, and the reason why we've done our research, I'm not saying this to scare you, but we need to understand the power of numbers here. So for example, if I'm sharing a number early, I put myself at the risk of sharing a number that's way too high, and I'm just immediately going to block myself from future rounds without being able to actually have a conversation about it. And if I share a number that's too low, I leave money on the table. So for example, let's say that there's a role open at LinkedIn and they're willing to pay anywhere from 100,000 to 120,000. Well, if I come in and I say, I want to be making 150,000. That's 30,000 above the budget. That's probably going to be a little bit of a stretch for that role. And so LinkedIn might say, well, thanks, Austin, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates at this time. And I may not know why, but it came down to salary in that specific situation. Whereas if I really would have been happy with 115 or 120, and I was just trying to take some negotiation tactic that I learned in an article I read online and apply it, I may have just screwed myself a little bit and not given myself that opportunity, when if I had been able to have the conversation, I would have been fine backing down to 115, 120. So that's why we don't want to share a number that's a little bit too high. On the low end, the reason we don't want to share a number that's too low, if I come in and I say, I'd be very comfortable making $85,000 in this role. Well, I just left a bunch of money on the table, right? If the range for this role is 100 to 120, I left a minimum of 15 grand on the table and a maximum of, I believe, 35, if my math is right there, on the table, right? So I just lost out on a ton of money for myself, and the company's loving me because they're like, yeah, Austin, get in here. Like, we thought you were the best candidate anyways, and now you're giving us a massive discount, a $30,000 discount. Yeah, come on in. Like, you're good. So that's where we need to be careful here, and that's why we do the research up front. But when we have this conversation, the key things that we want to do is, one, establish the fact that money is not our top priority, that fit is our top priority, and also establish the fact that we're flexible. So the numbers that we're sharing, the range that we're sharing, these aren't set in stone. So here's how this conversation might happen, right? The recruiter shows up and you're on the call and things are going well. And then they ask you the question, may I ask how much you make at your current company? We're trying to gauge if you're in the right range. Now, Andrew rightly mentioned that in some states and areas, it's illegal for them to actually ask this question. They can't ask you how much you're making at your current company. A lot of companies circumvent this by essentially saying, or by changing the language. So instead of saying, how much do you make at your current company? They say, what are your expectations for salary in this role? So they're not technically asking you what you've made at your last company, but they are asking you, if you got hired, how much would you expect to be making, right? And that's pretty much the same question. It's not as invasive, but it's still pretty daunting to answer. So the way that I respond here is by shifting the conversation away from money. So what I'm going to say is, I'm very open to negotiation, but my top priority is finding the right fit. Once that's established, I'm more than happy to talk salary. So what we're doing here is a couple of things. First, we're basically telling them, hey, you came in with the money piece, but for me, this is about fit. Like, I care about culture. I care about the company's mission. I care about the values. I care about all these things that we've talked about in the interview. Yes, I want to be compensated fairly, but that's not the most important thing to me. So we're establishing off the bat that money is not the most important thing to us. And that's a really, really important thing to do, because what's going to happen is when they bring it back to money, now all of a sudden the dynamic shifts a little bit mentally, because they're the ones who are all about the money, not you necessarily. And that power dynamic can be impactful and substantial in future conversations here. The other thing that we're doing is we're leaving it open-ended for them to take the next step with us, right? So we're not giving a range up front. And that's the other most important thing to do here. We want to delay giving a number as long as we possibly can. So no good recruiter is probably going to let us get through to the next round without sharing a number. And again, if they try to push you through, you can then still ask this same next question that we're going to talk about here. And we have a slide for that one as well, so we can pop that up. But the recruiter will probably come back to you and say, I understand that you want a good fit. We really want a good fit too. However, we're not able to move forward with candidates unless we know what range they fit in, unless we're aligned on that range. So this is them pushing you for a number, right? They want to get you to say the number first. But the truth is, at most companies, these recruiters are given a role, a budget. They're given a budget or a range for the role that you are applying for or that you're interviewing for. They know what that is. So what I like to do here is I try to put the ball back in their court. I try to get them to share the role or the range that they have budgeted for the role with me. And I don't really have anything to lose here at this point, but I have a lot to gain, because if they share the range that they've budgeted for this role, all of a sudden they've given the number first. And that's exactly what we want, right? That plays into you being at an advantage because you know their number and you haven't had to share yet. And now you could say, that's within the range that I was expecting. And all of a sudden you've gotten out of this conversation without having to give a number, and you know exactly where this company stands. In some cases, recruiters won't be willing to share a number, and that's okay. This is probably where we're going to have to share a number next, but we want to push it into their court, because also concessions are a big part of the negotiation philosophy as well. And we can talk about that more in just a second. So your response to the next question here will essentially be, I totally understand that we want to be aligned on salary. I understand that we need to be in the range right before we move forward. I don't want to waste anybody's time. If you're open to it, would you be able to share the role or the range that you have budgeted for this role? And that way we can see if we're on the same page. And if they say yes, you have that number. And if they say no, then we can move into the next part of the script. So obviously, if they say yes, you're good to go. If they say no, this is where that range that we pre-calculated comes into play. So more than likely what's going to happen here is that this person's going to come back to you and say, I'm not able to share the budget for this role, but I still need a number from you. So is there any way that you could give me a ballpark figure or something like that so that we could move forward? So this is where you're going to want to share that range that you came up with earlier. This is where you're going to want to share that 70 to 80% range that aligns with your target, but also the ranges that you found for this company. And you're going to want to word this specifically. So the way that I word this is like so. I'm currently being considered for roles in the range of X to Y. However, as I mentioned earlier, I'm flexible on salary and finding the best fit is my top priority. So by doing this, we're doing a couple of things. By saying it that way, we're doing a couple of things. First, we're implying that we're being considered for roles in this range. So we're not just saying, I'd hope to make, I'd like to make, which kind of that language isn't very strong. It's not very assertive. It's not very direct. It seems a little softer, a little weak, and companies are going to pick up on that. Whereas if you say, I'm being considered for roles in the range of blank, you're basically saying, hey, I'm being considered for other roles and they're in this range. So if you all don't meet that range, I have other options here. That creates some more leverage for you. Then what we're saying is reiterating that money isn't the number one thing that we're focused on here, right? And that instead, what we want to focus on is the fit. So what this opens you up for is a conversation, right? So if you go too high, right? If they've budgeted 100 to 120K and you say 140, then if you follow that up by saying, but I'm flexible and I want the right fit, now you've given the other person the opportunity to say, I'm so happy to hear you say that. We think this is a really good fit. However, 140 is a little bit higher than what we have budgeted. Can we have a conversation about other options here? And now what you can do is have that further conversation. You can gauge the options. And if it's still a no, it's still a no. But you never know what they might be able to come back with. And if you don't give them that option, if you just say, here's the number and I'm not flexible on this, or you imply that, then you could shut the conversation down. And that's where you could end up in a situation where the company is like, well, they're just too expensive for us. We have to go with somebody who's less expensive. So that keeps the doors open for you. So if you handle the conversation that way, if you open up by shifting away from dollars, and then if you ask the recruiter for the role that they have budgeted, or the range, I'm really struggling with those two words. If you ask them for the range that they've budgeted for this role, and then you shift to the sharing the number that you have. One, you're delaying yourself sharing a number. And two, you're giving yourself the opportunity to see what their number is first. And then three, you're keeping the doors open for the conversation, no matter what numbers are shared and no matter what budgets have been set before this conversation, which allows you to make the most informed decision.
Great. Yeah, no, and I think those tips are all fantastic. And for people in the comments who may have missed something, or maybe they want to hear something again, after we're done with this conversation, you'll hit refresh and you could watch this all over again. So don't worry if you missed anything. It'll still be here once we're done, and you could watch it over again and see those slides. And, Austin, we were talking about really base salary and all of those, but you did mention, there might be other options. So maybe you do max out their range, but they say, hey, maybe we could do some other things for that, because there are obviously other things that come with employment that people find important. So how do you have that conversation?
Definitely. So one of the biggest things to understand about negotiation is that psychologically, when somebody asks us to make a concession, they're more willing to make a concession themselves. And we've seen this in real life, right? Where if somebody asks you to do something, so let's say somebody asks, me like, hey, Austin, do you want to be on this podcast? And I don't really want to be on that podcast. My natural inclination is to say, it's not the right time, but I'll do this other thing for you, because I don't necessarily want to come off as a bad person, right? I don't want to come off as, unfriendly or uncooperative or any of these things. And we see this with our friends, right? If they ask us to do something, we feel kind of guilty and we want to make it up to them in some way. So we always add these qualifiers, like, I can't do it, but I'll do this other thing for you. And this has actually been studied. Like all the stuff that I'm mentioning today on this session, there is research to back all of this stuff up. So that is a real psychological principle that's playing out here as we negotiate. And so that's why we want to get the recruiter, the person we're speaking to make concessions whenever we can. So if they're not able to give us that range, I'm sorry, I can't give you the budget for this role. Then they might follow that up by offering a concession to us because they feel bad, right? So that's what we're trying to play into here by buying ourselves more time, by increasing the number of steps in the conversation. This also goes for the package itself. So many of us get caught up on base salary, right? I want to have this specific base salary. This is my biggest goal. But what we miss out on here is twofold. One, we miss out on other things that may in some cases be worth more than salary. And then two, we may be missing out on just these other options in general, which could have created a better compensation package for us. So if we had to make a concession in salary, but we made it up elsewhere, we're still in a really good spot. So the biggest thing that I want people to do is sit down, and I want you, before you even step into the phone screen for your interview, you need to have this ready to go before you even start having these conversations. I want you to sit down and make a list of all of the things that come with a new job. And we actually have a bunch of these on a slide here. So you could be looking at bonus, right? You could be getting equity in the company. You could negotiate your work setup. Do you want to have a hybrid schedule? Do you want to be 100% remote? Do you want to negotiate 100% in the office? Maybe you're relocating, right? And you want a reload package. You could negotiate commuter costs, equipment like a computer, et cetera, benefits, continuing education, visibility on certain projects, FaceTime with certain people, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that can potentially come with a new role. So what I want you to do is write out all of these things, and I want you to rank them by priority. So from top priority to lowest priority, I want you to have all of these in a list. And then what I want you to do is think about what these could potentially look like if you don't get your target salary. So if somebody says, okay, we can offer you X, and X is below what you were hoping for, now you're able to come back and say, thanks so much for this generous offer. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to work with this team. The range I had shared was between, Y and Z, and X is on the lower end of that range. Is there a way that we could potentially make this up with, and then you insert your top priorities? So if the work setup is important to you, you could say, if you're willing to be flexible on the work setup and allow me to work 100% remote, I'd be very happy to accept an offer at that salary with the 100% setup, or with the 100% remote setup. If bonus or equity is really important to you, you could say, that is a bit lower on the range that I had mentioned. For X, Y, and Z reasons, I think I'm a really, really strong candidate for this role. Is it possible to make up the difference in bonus, or is it possible to make up the difference in equity? And now what we're doing is we're not just having, one layer of negotiation. We're not just saying, I want X dollars, they say no, and then we're screwed and we either have to accept or decline the offer. Now we're able to come back to the table and say, thank you for this generous offer, but is it possible to make up the gap with these other things? And the worst thing that they say is no, which leaves you in the same position you would have been anyways if you didn't ask for this stuff. But what I found is more often than not, a lot of these things are much easier for the company to say yes to, because equity, you only really get it if you stay with the company. Bonuses, you only really get it if you perform well. Other things like continuing education, that can come out of a different budget for the company that's not necessarily allocated for payroll specifically. And maybe they have a bit more budget in that pool. Companies can get really creative with how they offer these types of things to their employees, but we'll never know what they can do for us unless they ask. So you want to have these things ready to go. I always had 3 plans. So I would have my plan A. This is the comp package that I want right off the bat. This would be my number one choice. If they say no to that, here's my plan B, here's my setup for that, here's what that looks like, and here's my plan C. And that way I could come back to them twice before I had what would be considered a quote final offer that I would either have to accept or decline, knowing that I'd gone through everything else and all the cards were on the table.
Really good points. And in fact, I remember a story. Someone said that they once negotiated being able to have FaceTime with a senior executive like you had there, and they were able to basically, I think it was like once a month, have lunch with that person. And what ended up happening is they were able to get connected to other people in the executive part of the company, and they ended up moving up into that sort of level because they were able to make those connections and learn about sort of higher level projects. So all of those things are really, really fantastic to negotiate on, and you shouldn't forget them. Even if they end up giving you really good, compensation with a base salary, you could still talk about all those things and say, hey, can I also include this or that in the equation? And I want to get to some of the questions people are asking because we have so many good ones. And one of them I want to get to, I saw earlier on in the conversation, is from Gyarthe. And she wanted to know, what if the company gives you a salary range up front that is pretty, acceptable? So I've seen this happen to people where, they say, oh, I want 60 grand. And then all of a sudden the company comes and says, hey, we're offering 80. And the person's like, wow, that's great, I'll take it. What is is that okay? What is your recommendation in those situations?
Yeah. So in most cases, I think I typically see that companies, if you say your number, in most cases companies aren't necessarily coming back and saying, well, thanks for that number, but we actually would have paid you 20 grand more. Usually it's just that's within our budget and you're sort of set in stone there, or not set in stone, but you have your anchor set and you have that understanding and you've shared your number, because companies typically, like we said, they don't want to give away too much information. But if that person was willing to share that they're willing to pay up to 80, I would use that to your advantage. And I would just say, thanks for sharing that information. I'm looking forward to, next steps. If there's anything that I can share, let me know. You hop off the call. And then as you progress through the rounds, you're creating that plan, right? So you said 60 initially. How do we get up to 80? Well, we can use that same language that we talked about before. So then when you get to the final round and the company says, I know that you mentioned that, 60 was acceptable for you. We're actually willing to go above that. We're willing to give you 65. You can come back and say, thank you so much for this generous offer. It's especially helpful if you prepare a little bit of some value that you can use as supporting evidence. So what I like to do is prepare maybe a one sheet, or I can write this out in an email even, and I can say, here are the specific things that I feel that I bring to the table here. Here's me telling you why my value is worth what I'm about to ask for. And then you can say, the person that I spoke to initially said that the range budgeted for this role was actually $80,000. To be transparent, I've also been interviewing at other companies, or you can use the language. If you haven't been interviewing at other companies, you can use that same language we talked about before, which is, in between our conversation and now, I'm being considered for roles that are closer to the $80,000 range. So is there any way for us to make up that gap? And then you can fall into the base salary, bonus, equity, all of these other things conversation. So that enables you to work your way back up from a lower number that you might have shared to a number that's, more aligned with the top end of the range that the person shared with you. So that's probably how I would handle that situation.
Got it. And we have a lot of people asking about first jobs. So we have, I think it was Aso in the comments, Jade, and I think Tanya was also asking, how do you negotiate when it's your first job? And I think a lot of people, they feel intimidated when they're just getting out of college or they're just graduating and they're entering the workforce. So what is your suggestion for someone who's just brand new? They've never had a full-time job and they're really doing this for the first time.
Yeah, so I would go through the exact same conversation that we just spoke about. If you use that framework, you are doing everything right. So you're researching upfront. You're talking about fit over dollars, which companies love to see from younger employees. They want to see people who are hungry to learn and to grow and to be, a team player and all of these things, instead of somebody who's coming out and just saying like, I want the money. So we're setting that perception, we're setting that expectation up front, which is really powerful. And then we're pushing it back on the recruiter so that we could potentially get that range, right? And then at the end of the day, your value is your value. So if you go out there and you look at the ranges and you look at the data and you see what's out there for the roles that you have, we do need to take some things with a grain of salt, right? So if you are working in a job title that has a bit of a range where people might be working in that job fresh out of school and people might also be working in that job 5 years out of school, that same job title, we do have to factor that in. We do have to have a bit of an understanding there. But if you adjust based off of that and you know the data, you can still feel comfortable asking for, whatever range makes the most sense to, or at least aligns with the value that you believe that you should be paid. And the biggest thing here is creating that value proposition, right? So there's a lot of ways to go about this. Something that I did, and really what sells it through, is being the most valuable candidate, showing this company that you want it most. So what I personally did was, for all of these companies, I would create something that I call the value validation project. If you just run a search for that online, I have a whole article about it and you can check it out. But essentially what it was a 4 to 5 slide deck that basically said, hey, here's the research I've done in your company. Here's what I understand the challenges, the goals, the initiatives are for this role. And here are a couple of ideas that I have. Here are a couple of things that I think we could do if you hired me. Here's some supporting evidence for why I'm the best candidate. And that went really, really far in terms of me setting myself apart from everybody else who just relied on a resume or a cover letter, et cetera. So it's really about illustrating your value and making a business case for why you align with that salary that you are asking for, and also having that salary be within the realistic range of what they're willing to pay people who are out of college. But by no means should you not negotiate simply because you're coming out of college or grad school or whatever it is. In fact, a lot of companies bank on that because they look at somebody who is a recent grad and they'll say, well, this person doesn't have much experience. They're probably in more of a vulnerable position because they don't currently have a job. Maybe they have student loans. I can probably have a conversation with this person and be far more educated about the salary, the market, the competition, et cetera. And I can get a better deal for our company versus, somebody who has 5 years of experience and who's done this a couple of times. So don't shortchange yourself just because you're coming out of school. Instead, go through the same process, arm yourself with the knowledge and the data, and go through the framework. And I promise you'll end up with as close to a maximized package as you can get.
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion overall about how someone can approach that. And we have another question here from Milani. And Milani is asking, what do you do if you lowballed yourself in the beginning of the conversation, but you'd like to negotiate further along in the hiring process? So maybe someone, they started interviewing, now they're watching the show and they're going, oh dear, I messed this up for myself. What's your advice for them?
So it really comes back to a couple of the points that we've already mentioned. We need a way to ask for that increase, but we need to justify it as well, right? Because if you said, I'm comfortable with $60,000 for this role, and then you get to the final round and you find out that they're willing to pay 80, we can't just say, well, pay me 80 because that's what you were going to pay somebody else, or that's what you had budgeted. In an ideal world, that's how things would work because, that's the budget they had. This is the person who was hired. They pay them what they had budgeted. But this is business, right? And we're always trying to maximize profits, minimize expenses, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need a justification for why that additional money is warranted. Some justifications might be that you're being considered for other roles at other places that are in this higher range now. Other justifications might be the value that you believe you bring to the table. Other justifications might be additional value that you add during the process. So for number one there, being able to show up and say, well, I'm currently, since we spoke last, I'm now being considered for roles in this higher range. Is there anything we can do to make up that gap? I know I mentioned 60 initially. I'm now being considered for these other roles in a higher range. You all said that the range was actually 80. If we could land somewhere, in this new range, this is my number one choice. I would, be happy accepting that offer, and I'd be really excited to work for this team. That's one way to get there. The other way is, like I said, value validation project, or you can put together an email or a one sheet that basically says, here, I know that these are the goals or the challenges or the initiatives for this role. I know that, if we're able to accomplish them, here's the ROI, here's the value, here's what I've done for other companies in the past. Here's some bullets. Here are some, previous results that showcase the fact that I've done this before. I believe that I can drive that for you. And I think that that's, well worth an extra whatever, every year, or this additional bonus or this additional equity or whatever it is. But you should absolutely ask, but you do need to have some sort of business case or justification for why you're going from, the number that you said was acceptable to the number that you have now.
Got it. And, and one thing that we talked about a little bit is remote jobs earlier. And Claudia and Juan have a really good question, which is basically, does any of this change based on remote jobs? Because if a company is remote, it's not like you're in New York City or Denver or someplace like that where you could say, okay, the cost of living in this area is this much. But with a remote job, your cost of living in, let's say, Omaha, Nebraska could be completely different than where other people at the company are living. So how do you sort of deal with those differences when, we have this surge of remote jobs?
For sure. So what I would say is this all comes back to your research, right? So if you're researching, you want to be looking up these average salaries nationally. You want to be looking up what these salaries are for remote roles if you can find that data. And then you also want to be looking up what these salaries are for the area that you'll likely be working out of. In a lot of cases, there's tax implications for companies based on where their employees work. There's also tax implications for the individual. And so that's something that needs to be factored in here. So what you want to be doing is understanding really what the adjusted salary is for your location. Now, if the company is willing to pay you, a New York salary and you're living in Des Moines, awesome. Like, don't say anything, take it, run, you're good to go, sign that offer letter as soon as you can. But if the company is giving you, if you're living in New York and they're giving you a Des Moines salary, well, now maybe there's a little bit of a conversation to be had. The only way to be able to handle this in the proper fashion is to have that information on hand, is to be educated on these different ranges, both at the national level and at the area that you'd be working at. As well as, where these roles sit in just other major cities or other areas of the country. So I would definitely include that in your research. I would make a point to understand those specific things. And then I would take, the figure that they give you and I would compare it to the data that you have. And I would see if, that's something that you need to dig deeper into, or if that's something that you should, get that offer as fast as you can and sign that paper and be good to go.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And also, if you're dealing with a large company, hopefully they're smart enough to know that, cost of living varies across the country and they're going to have to account for that. And, we have a question here that is also a really good one, because especially now that depending on where people live, the labor market is tight and companies are trying to hold on to the people that are already there. What if you're in the running for a internal promotion or maybe a job internally? And because obviously they have more information about what your current salary is, things like that. And we have questions about this from Estera and Logan. So what would your suggestion be for internal negotiations?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would do, depending on the company that you're working for, the first thing I would do is go look and see if there's information available. So, when I worked at Microsoft, every employee had a level at Microsoft. And based on the level, you were eligible for a certain base salary. And there was a band. And the bands were kind of continuous. They overlapped with one another, as you moved up. And so if you could get a promotion to a certain level, or if you knew a job that you were applying for was at a certain level, you could have an idea of what that range was. The other thing that's really, really powerful here is relationships. So if you can go talk to somebody who is already at that level at a company, whether it's, maybe the mentor that you negotiated FaceTime with at your last role, or just somebody that you've built a relationship with, or whatever it is. If it's somebody who is, let's say you are an account manager and you have an account executive and you want that executive role, like anybody who's in that role or anybody who has insight into that role that you can trust to have a conversation with, I would totally go talk to them and try to collect some information. You don't necessarily have to ask them what they make, but you can say, hey, would it be out of line for me to request X dollars or this type of package or whatever it is? And you can collect that information from what's essentially a primary source. And the more sources you have, the larger your sample size, the more confident you can be in that ask. And then finally, what I would say is you have an advantage. Like, yes, the company has the advantage of knowing your salary and other people's salaries and the value that you bring, but you have the advantage of knowing the exact ROI that you drive for this company. So like for me, when I was working at Microsoft, I had the luxury of being in sales, which is a heavily numbers focused area. But this applies across the board, whether you're in the creative side, whether you are, in a non-numbers focused role, you still can quantify the ROI that you drive for the company. There's a reason a company is willing to pay you the salary that you have. So if you don't understand that quantifiable ROI, you need to go seek it out. And there are many, many different ways to do that, which we could do a whole nother live on. But when you know your quantifiable ROI, that makes it so much easier because, if I'm driving, let's say $10 million of new business every year for my company, asking for an extra $20,000 this year on my base salary, if the company truly believes that I'm the person to deliver on that 10 million, that's a drop in the bucket, right? Of that extra 10 million. And so I can very readily make that case and feel confident about it because I can say, look, I'm sitting here with you. This is the final round. I know you all and what the expectations are. You know me and what I'm capable of. Here's my track record for the last few years. I can deliver on this 10 million. But here's where I'm at. Here's where I want to be. Is it possible for us to make that happen? If so, I'm ready to accept and hit the ground running. So you also have advantages being an employee of this company. I wouldn't just let the company get away with the information that they have. I would think about how the information that you have and the value that you have as an employee can create an advantage for you in these conversations.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really strong tips. And especially like you said, focus on the numbers. And if you make it to sort of a final round, people are going to say, okay, you are worth our time and investment, and we could be a little bit more flexible with this. And my next question is really for our viewers, our LinkedIn superstars who are joining us in the stream. And it's actually more of a request. We want to always do really great shows and conversations like the one we just had with Austin, but we need your help and we need your input. So I'm going to ask them to put up a little slide on the screen, and you're going to see a link, and you're also going to see a QR code. So go to one of those, either type the link into a browser or put your phone up to a screen, and you're going to see the little QR code, and it'll open up a survey and tell us what you liked about today's conversation, what you didn't like. Tell us what topics that you would like to see discussed in the future. That way our teams can really take this and say, okay, here's how we could help them most, because that's ideally what we want to do. We get together and we try and figure out how we can best help all of you, our LinkedIn members. So be sure to go to the survey. Like I said, click that link, use the QR code, and tell us your thoughts. And then that will inform the conversations we have in the future. So like I said, just, use the link, the QR code, and we can't wait to hear for your feedback. And also, Austin, thank you so much for joining us. I learned a lot, and I know everyone in the stream learned a lot too.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. It's always a pleasure. I can't wait to catch up again soon. And outside that, stay safe and healthy. We'll talk to you soon.
Of course, and I hope everyone will follow you on LinkedIn and find all of your information on your website. People can find that on the link just up there right now. And then obviously to all of you watching, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm sure you've all learned a lot. Please stay safe. Obviously, the pandemic is still sort of in flux around the world. You can only be a good candidate. You can only get hired if you're safe and well enough to do so. So be sure you're taking care of yourselves. And until we meet again, best of luck.